Chapter 45. They waited until late afternoon. Will knew the light was more uncertain and deceptive at that time. Then, leaving Tug and Kicker in the grove of trees, they stole forward. Horace was wearing the camouflage cloak, but this was no time for joking, and he listened intently as Will gave him some last-minute instructions. "Keep the cowl up so your face is shaded," he said. "When we stop, lie perfectly still, keeping the cloak around you. Halt's old saying used to be, 'Trust the cloak. It'll conceal you.'" "What about my legs and feet?" Horace asked. As he was a good deal taller than Halt, more of his legs were exposed below the cloak. Will shook his head in a dismissive gesture. "Don't worry about them. The cloak will conceal your body, and people don't expect to see disembodied legs lying around. They see what they expect to see." Horace grinned. "Is that more of Halt's wisdom?" Will grinned in return, nodding his head. "One other thing," Will reminded him. It was something the tall warrior had heard before, but it always bore repeating. "If we're moving and someone appears, just freeze. Stand perfectly still. It's the movement that attracts attention and gets you seen," Horace finished the statement. "I know." "So long as you do. The temptation to try to hide is almost irresistible in that situation." They moved forward, Will taking the lead and slipping silently and almost invisibly through the uncertain light. He dropped behind an outcrop of rocks some 30 meters away from the trees and signaled Horace to follow. He watched the warrior for a few meters, then turned his attention to the hills ahead. Tennyson didn't seem to have any guards in place, but that didn't mean they weren't concealed somewhere. A part of his mind was impressed with the progress that Horace was making with his silent movement. He still made a certain amount of noise, of course. It took years of training to achieve the level of silence with which a ranger could move. But he was surprisingly quiet, and Will doubted that any casual listener in the vicinity would have realized that someone was moving through the grass. Horace slowly lowered himself into cover beside him. Will glanced at the face inside the folds of the cowl. He could feel the tension in Horace's body. The young warrior was concentrating fiercely on moving with minimal noise and visibility. Too fiercely, in fact. "Relax a little. There's a tendency to make more noise if you're all tensed up," Will told him in a lowered voice. "You're doing fine. You're definitely getting the hang of this." He saw the brief flash of Horace's teeth, bared in a grin of pleasure. "Think I'd make a ranger?" he asked. Will snorted derisively. "Don't get ahead of yourself," he said. Then he gestured towards the hills ahead of them. "Come on." Moving carefully, in short increments, it took them over half an hour to reach the base of the hills. There they found a jumble of rocks, sandstone mainly, which had fallen from higher up the slopes. There was plenty of cover, and they settled in a cleft between two boulders, looking around to spot the entrance to one of the caves. "See anything?" Will asked. Horace shook his head. "No, but I can still smell the smoke." They both looked up to the spot where they had seen smoke issuing from a cleft in the rocks. Now they could see nothing. But Horace was right. The smell of wood smoke was still strong on the evening air. Will surveyed the rocks and open ground around them. There was no sign of any human habitation. Finally, he leaned closer to Horace and whispered, "You stay here and keep an eye on things. I'll see if I can find a way in." Horace nodded. He settled himself between two large boulders, placing himself so that he had a good field of vision, yet stayed relatively concealed himself. His hand went to the sword at his side, but he left it undrawn. If he needed it, he could have it out and ready in a heartbeat. Yet, if he drew it now, the gleaming blade might reflect the dull light and give his position away. Will ghosted forward until he reached the base of the cliffs. Flattening himself against the almost sheer rock, he edged along laterally. A large buttress of sandstone jutted out, and he slid around it, disappearing from view for a few seconds. Then he reappeared, signalling to Horace, pointing to the rock face on the other side of the outcrop. His meaning was clear. He had found an opening. He was going inside. Horace waved that he understood, and Will disappeared again, walking soft-footed around the sandstone outcrop. The opening was well concealed, all but invisible until you were almost upon it. It was barely a body-width wide, nothing more than a slit in the rock, but on closer inspection, Will saw that it ran deeper. He turned side on and slipped through the cleft. His quiver snagged momentarily on the rough rock at his back, and he had to wriggle it free. Then he continued. Horace would have loved this, he thought. It was pitch dark, and the narrow constricting passage twisted like a snake, so that the walls seemed to bear down upon him. He fought back a moment of panic, understanding for the first time in his life how such a place could unnerve his friend. He inched forward, beginning to fear that this was a false trail, and the narrow gap would eventually peter out, leading nowhere. Then, rounding a final right angle, he found himself in a larger open space, about the size of a bedchamber. The ceiling of the cave was high, and light came through several clefts high in the wall. It was the last light of day, and only faint, yet after the total darkness of the passage he had just traversed, it was a welcome change. He hesitated at the entrance, taking stock of his surroundings. There was no sign of anyone here, and the light was too dim for him to inspect the sandy floor for footprints. He toyed with the idea of lighting a torch, but decided against it. The darkness was his protection, his friend, his shield. In these Stygian conditions, the sudden bright flare of flint on steel might well be noticeable for hundreds of meters. He stepped out into the open space. His eyes were of little use in this dimness, so he reached out around him with his other senses. His hearing, his sense of smell, and that peculiar sixth sense that he had been trained to develop and listen to, an instinctive awareness of the space around him, and the possible presence of other people in it, that had alerted him so many times in the past to potential danger. The air was surprisingly fresh. He had expected it to be dank and earthy here inside the rocks. But then, of course, the clefts that provided light would also ensure that the cave was well ventilated. He turned around, slowly, describing a full circle. His eyes were closed as he sought to concentrate on his other senses. He reached out with them. He heard voices. Many voices, in a low rising and falling pattern that could only be one thing: chanting. They came from the far wall of the cavern, and he crossed quickly to it, feeling his way along until his fingers discovered another cleft. This one was lower, barely 1.5 meters in height. He bent and slipped through it, once again in darkness, reaching ahead and upward, and crabbing forward in a half-crouch. Gradually, the ceiling became higher, and he could walk upright, his outstretched hand above him touching only empty air. This tunnel ran relatively straight, without the twists and turns of the first. And after the first few meters, it widened out into a comfortable thoroughfare. At least, he assumed it did. He stayed touching the wall of rock and stretched his hand out into the darkness, searching for the far wall. He encountered nothing. The muffled sound of chanting, which had continued as he progressed through the darkness, gradually became stronger and louder, then suddenly stopped. Instinctively, he stopped as well. Had he made some noise? Had he alerted the chanters? Did they suddenly realize that he was here? Then a single voice began to speak. He couldn't make out the words, they were muffled and distorted by the rock, but he could hear the timbre and the pitch and the cadence of the voice. It was the voice of a trained speaker, an orator accustomed to swaying his listeners to his own point of view. He'd heard the voice before. It was Tennyson. He sighed with relief. "So, you're here after all," he said softly into the darkness. He edged forward again, and the voice became more distinct. Now he was able to make out individual words. One in particular he heard repeated over and over again, Alcaeus. Alcaeus, the false golden god of the outsiders. Now Tennyson seemed to be asking the crowd questions. His voice would rise in an interrogative tone, and there would be a pause, then an answering roar from the crowd. And while Tennyson's questions weren't yet decipherable, the answering roar from the crowd definitely was. "Alcaeus!" they cried, in answer to his every question. The tunnel Will was following veered slightly to the right, and as he rounded an elbow in the wall, he saw something ahead. A glimmer of light. He moved forward more quickly, his soft boots making no sound on the sand underfoot. 10 more meters, and the light was stronger with each pace. Then he reached the opening, and before him, in the light of 50 or more torches, he saw the man they had been pursuing for the past month. White-robed, burly, and with long grey hair, he stood on a natural rock platform in the massive cavern that had opened out from the narrow tunnel. Around him were grouped about 20 followers, also dressed in white. And beyond them were close to 100 people, men, women, and children, mostly dressed in rough homespun country clothing, all listening with rapt attention to the words that came from the prophet's mouth. And as Will watched, he heard, and this time understood, the question that the fake prophet was posing to his new followers. "Who will lead us out of the darkness? Who will take us to a new golden age of friendship and prosperity? Tell me his name." And the reply came from over 100 voices, young and old. "Alcaeus!" Will shook his head sadly. The same old rigmarole, the same old mumbo-jumbo. But people were just as willing to buy it here as they had been in Hibernia. People were gullible, he thought, particularly when they were told they could buy their way to happiness. "You know, my friends, that times were bad before Alcaeus came among you." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. "Your stock were dying or disappearing. Your homesteads were burnt and levelled. Isn't that true?" The crowd called out their confirmation of his words. So, thought Will, the outsiders have had their armed brigands operating in this area as well, no doubt long before Tennyson arrived. "But, since you have taken Alcaeus as your god, have these attacks stopped?" "Yes!" cried the crowd. Some embellished the shout with cries of "Bless Alcaeus" and "Praise the golden god." And, "Is it time we gave thanks to Alcaeus? Is it time we built him the golden jeweled altar he desires, an altar that you can worship at for generations to come?" "Yes!" cried the crowd. This time, at the prospect of donating gold and other valuables, there was a little less enthusiasm. But the white robes around Tennyson added their voices to the cry. Except, Will thought to himself, that altar will be covered with a thin veneer of gold, and when you move on, the rest of it will go with you. But Tennyson's congregation didn't seem aware of that fact. Spurred on by the white robes and by Tennyson himself, they continued to raise their voices until the massive cavern rang with their cries of praise for Alcaeus and his priest, Tennyson. Time to leave, Will thought. He'd seen all this before.